This book tells a story about a phone call that surprised many people. The call was between the President of France and the President of Russia. These two leaders had not spoken directly for nearly 3 years. This long silence started because of the war in Ukraine. So, the decision for them to talk again was a big change and a risky one. Why did they talk now? The main reason was a dangerous situation happening in another country, Iran. There was a growing problem about Iran's nuclear program. France saw this as a very serious risk for the whole world. This crisis forced the French president to make a difficult choice. He chose to call the Russian president, even though their countries had big disagreements, especially about Ukraine. This phone call is more than just a simple conversation between two leaders. It shows that something important is happening in world politics. For a long time, many Western countries tried not to talk to the Russian president because of the war. This call breaks that. It is like the first sign of a possible new way countries might talk to each other in difficult times. The call happened while the war in Ukraine is still going on. The war is not finished. It is a difficult conflict with no clear end right now. But the problem in Iran was so serious that it made this unexpected call happen. It shows how complicated the world is today and how leaders sometimes must take risks to try and stop dangerous problems, even when other big problems, like the war, are not solved. 2. Friends before the war. Before the war in Ukraine, French President Emmanuel Macron and Russian President Vladimir Putin had a very different relationship. It started in the first years after President Macron became President of France. They met several times, including at the famous Palace of Versailles in France. Their personal connection seemed warm and friendly. President Putin spoke positively about President Macron in those early days. They had a way of speaking to each other that showed closeness. They used the informal French pronoun tu, not the formal vous. This is not common for world leaders and showed a strong personal relationship. For example, they both wrote a preface for a book about an important art show in 2021. This showed their shared interest in culture and their good relationship at that time. However, this warmth could not last when the situation with Ukraine became very serious. Tensions increased greatly. Before the full-scale war began, President Macron decided to make a final effort to stop it. He traveled to Moscow in February 2022. This trip was planned as a major diplomatic attempt to prevent the conflict through direct talks with President Putin. During that visit, President Macron spent many hours in discussion with President Putin. He used all his diplomatic skills, hoping that their past relationship and conversation could persuade President Putin to not start the invasion. It was seen as a last chance for diplomacy to succeed. But, sadly, this effort did not work. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia started very soon after his visit, in late February 2022. This event was the end of the personal warmth and understanding between the two leaders. The relationship broke down completely. For a period after the invasion, President Macron still tried to keep lines of communication open with President Putin. He believed that talking might still bring some results or help in certain situations. But these later conversations did not produce any positive outcomes. Their last direct talk before the recent phone call happened was in September 2022. That was a long time without speaking. Following the failure of diplomacy and the ongoing war, President Macron became a very strong supporter of Ukraine. France increased its help to Ukraine, sending military equipment and providing other support. France also strongly joined other Western countries in putting difficult economic penalties on Russia. President Macron publicly criticized Russia's actions many times. The friendly personal connection they once shared was replaced by deep political disagreement and public distance. In Russia, state television and government officials often spoke negatively about President Macron, showing how much the relationship had changed from friendship to hostility. 3. The problem with Iran. The phone call happened because of a big problem with Iran. This problem was about Iran's nuclear program. For many years, countries worried about Iran building nuclear weapons. Iran always said its nuclear work was only for peace, like making electricity. But recently, the situation became more dangerous. First, there were attacks on some of Iran's nuclear places. The United States and Israel were involved in these attacks. The attacks caused some damage and slowed down Iran's nuclear work for a time. After these attacks, Iran made a very important decision. Iran decided to stop working with the international agency that checks nuclear programs around the world. This agency is called the IAE, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Before this, experts from the IAE could visit Iran's nuclear sites and check what was happening. They could see the amount of nuclear material Iran had and how much it was enriching it. Enriching uranium means making it more powerful. Iran was enriching uranium to a high level. This level is not needed for peaceful energy. It is close to the level needed to make nuclear weapons. When Iran stopped the checks, the international agency's experts could no longer see inside the nuclear sites. They became blind to what Iran was doing. This meant nobody outside Iran knew exactly how much enriched uranium Iran had or what steps it was taking. For France, this was a very serious problem. France is a country that has nuclear weapons itself. It is also an important member of the United Nations. France believes it is very important to stop more countries from getting nuclear weapons. This is called not spreading nuclear weapons. Iran having a nuclear program without any international checks was seen by France as a big risk for global security. It was like a black box. Nobody could be sure what was happening inside. France thought this situation was too dangerous. It was a major threat to peace and safety in the world. This urgent situation with Iran's nuclear program was the main reason France decided to call Russia. Even though France and Russia did not agree on many other things, like the war in Ukraine, the Iran problem was big enough to make them talk. Both countries are important on the world stage and need to think about this danger. They hoped they could find some way to work together to deal with the problem with Iran. 4. The big phone call. The surprising phone call between President Macron and President Putin happened. It was a long call, lasting more than 2 hours. The two leaders talked about two very important things. The first was the problem with Iran and its nuclear program. The second big topic was the war in Ukraine. On the Iran issue, President Macron and President Putin found some things they agreed on. Both leaders were worried about the nuclear situation. They felt it was important to find a way to solve it through talking. They agreed that their countries should try to work together on this problem. However, when they talked about the war in Ukraine, their ideas were very different. There was no agreement at all. President Putin repeated his reasons for the war. He said it was the West's fault, and that Western countries did not listen to Russia's security needs. He also said that any peace must accept the new borders, meaning the land Russia had taken. President Macron strongly disagreed with this. He told President Putin that France supports Ukraine fully. He said that Ukraine is a country with its own borders and its own land. He said that borders cannot be changed by fighting. He also asked for the fighting to stop very soon. The conversation showed that even though they could find some agreement on the Iran problem, the war in Ukraine is still a very big problem that separates them. Their positions on the war are still very far apart. 5. The war is not over. The war in Ukraine continues today, sadly. It has been a long and hard war for more than 3 years now. The fighting is difficult every day, with soldiers fighting on long lines. These war lines do not change much. The armies attack and defend, but there are not many big changes on the map. Russia controls about 19 out of 100% of Ukraine's land. This includes parts of the east and south. Regions called Donetsk and Luhansk have parts controlled by Russia. Also, Crimea in the south is controlled by Russia. The war has a very high cost for everyone involved. Many people are hurt or have died. This is true for soldiers on both sides of the fighting lines. It is also very true for people who are not soldiers, for civilians. More than 46,000 people who are not fighting have been killed or hurt since the war started. But people think the real number is probably much higher. Millions of people from Ukraine have had to leave their homes because it is not safe. They are now living in other parts of Ukraine that are safer, or they have gone to different countries seeking help. The war is also very bad for money and business, for the economy. It costs Ukraine and Russia a lot of money to fight. It also causes problems around the world for many countries. It is harder to send food, oil, and other important things from one country to another country. This problem makes prices higher for many things, in stores for many people around the world. Finding enough energy can also be a problem because of the war. Many important buildings in Ukraine, like schools for children, hospitals for sick people, and places that make power for homes, are broken or destroyed from the fighting. It is very hard to find a way to stop the war and make peace. Many people from different countries have tried to talk with Ukraine and Russia. But Ukraine and Russia want things that the other side says no to. Ukraine says Russia must leave all Ukrainian land. They want the borders to be exactly like they were before the year 2014. President Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, says only Ukraine can decide about its land and its future. But Russia says the land its army took is now part of Russia forever. Russia also wants promises about Ukraine's future safety, saying Ukraine should not join certain groups. Because their wishes and ideas are so different, it is very difficult to find a path to end the fighting soon. The war is not over yet, and it is hard for anyone to see when it will really end. 6. A changing world. This phone call between President Macron and President Putin had a much bigger meaning than just talking about Iran. For almost 3 years, many leaders in Western countries decided not to speak directly to President Putin. This was part of a plan to show their strong disagreement with Russia's actions, especially the war in Ukraine. They wanted to isolate Russia in the world. The call on July 1, 2025 was the first time a major Western leader clearly stepped outside this plan. President Macron chose to call because the danger from Iran's nuclear program felt very urgent. By making this call, France was acting differently from some of its closest partners, like the United States and the United Kingdom, who had kept their distance from Putin. For Russia, this phone call was important. It showed that the Western plan to isolate Russia completely was perhaps not working perfectly. Russia could use this call to tell its people and other countries that it is still an important player on the world stage, and that powerful countries still need to talk to Moscow. It was a small win for Russia in the world of public relations. The call also gave a sign about France's own goals and place in today's world. The world is changing and becoming more complicated. There are now several very powerful countries, not just a few. The United States is still a superpower, but China is also becoming very strong. France wants to be a strong, independent country in this new world with many centers of power, a multipolar world. France believes it should have its own voice and act on its own when needed, not just follow others. French officials felt that the U.S. had acted on the Iran issue without talking enough to its European friends. This made France feel less important in a region where it has interests. The call to Putin was a way for France to show that it can act on its own and try to solve big global problems. It was a way to get back some influence and show that France is a key global player. So France's action was a type of gamble. Some people in other Western countries might worry that it makes their group seem less united. They might think it helps President Putin. But France's leaders believed that dealing with the Iran nuclear risk was so important that this diplomatic move was necessary, even if it had risks. This call showed how difficult it is for countries to balance their values and their need to deal with real dangers in a world that is always shifting. It suggests that finding solutions in this changing world might require new ways of talking, even with countries you disagree with strongly on other matters. 7. Experts and opinions. After the phone call between President Macron and President Putin, many people who study world politics shared their thoughts. These foreign policy experts had different ideas about if the call was a good thing. Some experts thought the call was a necessary risk. They saw the problem with Iran's nuclear program as very dangerous. They said that in such a serious situation, talking was needed, even if it was hard. These experts felt that Europe needed to talk to Russia sometimes, not just let the United States handle everything. They believed that if Europe did not talk, it might lose its place in important discussions about global issues. But other experts did not agree. They argued that talking to President Putin gave him an advantage. They said it made him seem like a normal leader again, even with the war in Ukraine happening. These experts thought it was wrong to talk to someone seen as an enemy. They believed that the call hurt the unity of the countries in the West. In Russia, experts saw the call more positively. They thought it could be a first sign of better relations between France and Russia, but they said it was too early to know for sure. They saw it as Europe being more practical by talking. People and politicians in France also had different opinions. Some French people supported President Macron's decision. They felt that talking was important for peace and to solve problems like the one in Iran. But other people in France were against the call. They believed it was wrong to talk to President Putin while the war continued. Different political groups in France also had mixed feelings about the call. Other countries in Europe reacted differently too. Germany seemed okay with the call, but they stressed that Europe must stay united. The United Kingdom was less sure about the call. Countries closer to Russia, like Poland and the Baltic states, were very worried. They felt that talking to President Putin was dangerous and hurt the effort to stand strong against him. The call started many discussions and showed that in difficult times, leaders face hard choices. People around the world have different opinions on the best way to deal with complex international problems and leaders. 8. The future. The phone call between President Macron and President Putin finished. It was a big event after 3 years of quiet. Now people think about what happens next. The call showed something important. Leaders must find a balance. Sometimes they must do what is right, like not talking to someone they disagree with strongly. These are their principles. But sometimes they must talk to solve big problems. This is about practical needs. The call helped open a door for talking about Iran. The leaders shared some worries about the nuclear problem there. This is a difficult situation, and many countries are concerned. Talking is one way to try and find a solution. Maybe France and Russia can work together on this specific problem in the future. This part of the call was seen as maybe having a positive result. But the call also showed the big problem that is still there, the war in Ukraine. On this topic, the two leaders had very different ideas. Their disagreement is very deep. President Putin repeated his reasons for the war. President Macron strongly supported Ukraine. It is hard to see how this problem can be solved when the two sides think so differently. The conversation did not change anything about the war. So, the call was a mix of hope and difficulty. It was a risk to talk after such a long time. Some people think it was a good idea because it is important to talk about very serious problems like the Iran nuclear issue. Other people think it was not a good idea because it might make President Putin seem like a normal leader again. The world is now watching. Will this one phone call lead to more talks? Will it help solve the problem with Iran? Will it change anything about the war in Ukraine, or will the disagreement remain a big obstacle? Nobody knows for sure what the future will bring after this call. What do you think will happen next after this conversation?
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.